Are we supposed to, we doing a podcast? Well, I mean, do y'all want us to do that? We can do it. Wait, you want the intro?
You got the intro?
You want the intro?
Let's do it.
Sure.
I got your intro.
To the table, sister.
Dynamic voices for a diverse church. This is Pass the Mic.
Greetings and God bless. Welcome to another episode of Pass the Mic. Dynamic Voices for a Diverse Church, powered by The Witness, a Black Christian collective. I'm your host, Tyler Burns. You can follow me on Twitter at Burns23. Follow at your own risk. And joining me, as always, is the president of The Witness, the man, the myth, the legend, the best-selling author, Mr. Blue Check Verified himself, Jamar Tisby. What's going on, man?
We are here at our
On stage.
first national conference.
I'm
so glad we got to do this.
I am as well, and I think what has happened is it's been a profound, it's very dangerous to do debriefs before, and reflections before it actually ends, but there's been a profound sense of healing, and there's been a profound sense of clarity for me personally, and so I just thank you guys for being here. We believe that, our theology is that it's not just the people on stage who matter, and it's not just the people on stage who create the environment, the atmosphere, but your presence here, like the dialogical aspect of the Black church, is that there's call and response. So we just appreciate you being here because you made this space what it is.
Yeah.
And so we just want to thank you guys. And so can you give yourselves a hand?
Y'all are
Yeah.
great.
Yeah, you
We're
guys
so
are
glad you're here.
And we're also here at the historic Ebenezer Missionary Baptist Church in Chicago, the birthplace of gospel music. And we have just enjoyed some amazing music so far, and amazing worship. And there's something holy about this space as well.
Yeah, we need to tell that story because Thomas A. Dorsey, who is a very well-known Black musician and composer, he got together a 100-person choir, and the first time they performed was at this very church. And so many people don't understand this distinction, but Ebenezer Church is known as the birthplace of gospel music. There's another church in Chicago, Pilgrim Baptist, that is called the home of gospel music. And there's a very interesting story behind that. You can Google it, but basically Thomas A. Dorsey, shortly after they performed as a gospel choir, went over to Pilgrim, and that's sort of where they made a name for gospel music. But it was right here where he first launched that choir. And so and then you said this in the introduction, who has been on this very stage? MLK, Mahalia Jackson, all of the folks who we look up to as leaders in the Black church and the civil rights movement have made their way through this church. So it's just this perfect blend of past and present and even future as we look at continuing the journey for Black joy and justice. Can we talk about the intentionality of choosing this space?
It's your show, man.
No, I'm just saying, but you can talk about it too. Talk about the intentionality of choosing who's on this stage.
Let me talk about the intentionality of choosing this space by saying something very important. Trust Black women. Very important. And here's the reason why I say that. Here's the reason why I say this. We were having conversations about what the venue would be, and there were so many considerations about tech, lights, and about ease of use, and we were going back and forth at the places we wanted that were on our wish list, and it seemed like all these doors were closing. And Ali Henny and Elodie on our team, they said, no, it will probably actually be better if why don't we choose a historic Black space? And yeah, we might not have, lasers and lights and fog, but there's something that you can't put a price tag on. There's something intangible that happens when we get together in a space that historically has preserved our narrative and our tradition. And I'm so thankful for them. I'm so thankful for them, because what they did, we actually had the opportunity to potentially get a free venue that would have been so much more tech and high tech and all this other stuff. but we thought that the space would be
Triggering.
triggering.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'll just leave it at that. But we thought the space would be triggering, and they were like, "Nah, we don't do that. Like, we build our own table.
Yeah.
You know, we build our own table in our own churches."
Yeah, yeah. And then the thoughtfulness of who we invited as speakers was very purposeful. So you've heard half of the keynotes, you've heard half of the breakouts, you already know the caliber and the quality. So we were looking for that. But we also, look, every person who's been on this stage is black. You don't get that at a lot of the conferences that we're familiar with.
Well, that was important to us.
That was hugely important to us.
And I can't imagine, and I cannot imagine, it is God's providence and sovereignty of God, because I cannot imagine having a different type of conference after having the week that we've had, right, in our country,
Oh,
and
yes.
considering all the various difficulties that we've had and the tension points within our community and the frustrations that we have been feeling in our bodies about kind of reliving the pain of losing one of our own that we didn't know but is really one of us. And then having to navigate that space in mixed company and having to function highly functional in work and church spaces and home spaces while we carry that with us. I actually can't imagine what that would have been like in another space. So
That's exactly right. So that's part of what we hoped to get, not just out of this conference, but out of the witness and any time we gather, right? When you've had a week like this, and can we name it? Just with Botham Jean, with the
say his name.
very,
Yeah, say his name.
and then his brother's response at the sentencing, Brant Jean offering forgiveness and embrace, tears, and that being the topic of public conversation with all the different viewpoints and perspectives. So we kind of knew this could happen. Like it was no surprise to us a year ago when we chose this date that it might just happen. It might just come right at the time when folks needed to process it.
Oh, I
right?
didn't know that.
Yeah.
I didn't know
Well,
that.
no, we knew
We did not have a
something.
conversation about that. Oh, no.
We knew it was very
Y'all trying to make me
likely.
seem like I'm like,
Look,
no, I did not know.
we knew it was very likely that there would be another public racial
Well,
incident.
Of course, but that's every week.
Ex-
Well, sure. I mean, pick your week. I mean,
But see, the difference is most of the times we'll have to process something like this in isolation. And that's when it feels like such a burden, when we feel like we're the only ones being assailed by these contrary opinions and viewpoints, like we have no one or very few allies who understand what our perspective and what we're trying to say, who won't twist it. And so I'm so thankful that we have gatherings like this, because you don't have to do it alone. That everybody in this room, everybody who's going to be listening, we are more on the same page than most of the time we're interacting with other folks. And there's a healing aspect to that. And that's what I wanted. That's what I hoped for. That's what we prayed for would happen at this conference.
well, let's briefly interact this whole idea of the forgiveness scene
Yeah.
in the courtroom. I think it's important for us to talk about this, and both Jamar and I have kind of shared our thoughts, spewed our thoughts. Like we just kind of had to come up with some
Twitter
quick-
fingers.
Yeah, Twitter fingers, or Jamar, who, as you can see with the pocket square, is a national writer, because only national writers have that bedazzled pocket square.
You taught me how to fold it.
And so Jamar wrote an article in the Washington Post. The title of the article is? It's an article in the Washington Post
White-
about
White Christians don't
mistake,
cheapen
don't cheapen
the
Brant John's forgiveness.
Brant John's forgiveness and his hug. Yeah.
How many of y'all felt a certain type of way when you hugged her? Honestly. Yeah.
Smattering.
Yeah, smattering people. I think it's important for us to like name how we're feeling in that moment, and name the unique tension points and particularities within our community as to why something like that not the act itself, but the surrounding circumstance and
That's right.
context of the act makes us feel.
That's right.
And I think there is a historic idea, and it's kind of put into you at a young age within black community, especially in black Christian spaces, that you're supposed to bend over backwards and not to seem like something that, number one, could get you physically harmed, number two, could prevent your progress, and number three, could be misinterpreted by the white gaze. And so there is a push, even, I remember when Michael Brown happened, when the Mike Brown shooting happened, I put up one post, and I was not, at that point, I was just not on this wave. Like, I don't even think I was hosting Pass the Mic at the time or anything. I was going in that direction, but I was more like, okay, let me just measure my steps and measure what I say. And I put up one post, and the flood, and I was like, I just said, I hate that this happened. And then people were like, how are you going to walk back your denunciation of the shooter, of the police? I'm like, bro, I didn't even, who are you? Why are you in my messages?
Look,
Why you pressing me?
we got to understand, like, that is one of the primary tactics, is to try to discredit your Christian confession.
And so
Yeah.
to that point, though,
Yeah.
to that point, I remember having this conversation with an older black man, and he was like, well, you know, not everybody knows what you mean when you say what you mean, you know? Not everybody knows what you're saying. So, you know, you may want to just, you know, you can run it by us, and you can, I was like, I don't know if this is right. I don't know if this is, because there is a sense in the older generation, though, of, man, if we said something like this, if we acted in that way, there would be immediate punitive, tragic consequences
Yeah.
and circumstances because of that. And so for us, I sat back and I was like, well, are you telling me that I'm not a Christian? Are you challenging my faith? Are you? And I think it's just that trauma that has literally been beaten, whipped into us. That if you get out of line, if you get out of step, we gonna get you. There are gonna be consequences. And there was a time where, I mean, for me personally, like, went through a lot of very difficult conversations within my city and very polarizing. I'm glad I went through it, though, because now I know. Now I know that I'm not spawning after anyone's acceptance and all those types of things. But I think it's like implicit within our community as well as a self-preservation mechanism.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's partly generational, right? Like, I think of my parents, and for them, it was unprecedented to have access in professional environments. And so just to get a white-collar job in middle management, right? Like, that was astronomically successful. And in that context, some of the things that my generation is pushing for or willing to say seems just like, you don't do that.
Right.
And I think it's going to be true for the future, too.
Right.
So younger generations coming after us are going to hear me talk and say, well, this is how you tread in society. And they're going to be like, no. Like, no, we have to push further. And honestly, it's because of that pushing each generation after generation after generation that we make progress at all. So I think we need to have respect, right? Like, so it's all respect as far as where people are coming from, and the things that my parents and their parents had to endure are nothing like, I've not been through anything like that. So we have to have that level of respect. But at the same time, we have to say, because of you, because of what you went through, I can now take it this step further.
So
Yeah.
how does that play itself out in the way in which white Christians interact with a moment like that?
Huh.
Because there was a similar moment that I'll talk about in a little bit with Emmanuel, Mother Emmanuel. And how is it, why is that a thing? 'Cause I honestly think there's some people who do not understand. And even black Christians don't understand. Well, of course, I mean, we're all forgiven. Christ offers forgiveness to us. Like, why would we be mad at that? Why would we be upset at that? And it's not the act, it's the context of
Yeah.
the act. And it's the context of how the act is used
Yeah.
in public discourse and against other black Christians.
Right. So when an act of forgiveness like that is done in public, it is done literally under the white gaze. That leaves it open to all kinds of misinterpretation and misuse. And I think that's what happened here. So my stance is, no one can tell Brant Jean not to forgive. Like that's a matter of his own conscience and the convictions of his faith.
That
And
is
nobody's,
not the issue. That is not the issue.
and nobody I follow is saying that, right? But what the narrative is, so then other people, especially black people, come along and say, well, don't use this man's forgiveness to shame black people into being forgiving of legitimate injustices. So don't use a virtue of the Bible as an instrument of oppression. And then what happened is when you raise that caution flag, it becomes real easy to say, oh, well, you don't believe in forgiveness. You're not believing in culture. This is what I had to pull up after that article. You know, I get a lot of interesting mail.
Really?
Yeah, you know, every once in a while.
You sure?
Yeah, but this one stuck out because it was so explicit in what he was doing. So this person randomly emails me after reading that article about forgiveness, and he said, you could learn something from, this is just the last two sentences. You could learn something from Brant Jean, but I guess you're so caught up in your own hatred that even a beautiful moment like this has no meaning. What a sad life you must live. Go back and listen to the words carefully of Brant, and maybe you too can turn your life over to Christ.
But that's why you were in that pocket square. You're trying to tell him, I'm living my best life.
We have joy because the world didn't give it. And it can't take it away.
But what you're talking about, though, what you're talking about is a weaponizing.
Yes.
So taking it and using it as a weapon to.
That's
and
right.
then there's like all these subtweets and everything. I'm like, this is kind of weird because you're taking grace and now using grace as a weapon.
Yeah.
It's like, how do you?
Yeah.
How do you do that?
Right.
And one of our team members, Adam Keeley, is our creative director, who did an amazing job putting all this together, along with a whole bunch of other team members. He mentioned something on Facebook as he was talking to white Christians about this. He said, don't forget that hug was big enough for her, not for you.
Oh. That's good.
So don't slide in the middle of the hug. You ever had somebody do
Like,
that?
can I just get in?
You ever
Group
had
hug?
somebody do an unsolicited group hug? I'm like, I was hugging Sister Jenkins and you came in. And
This wasn't for you. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes.
so I
yes.
think it's important for us to name the weaponizing of it.
Right. And what happens with this is the risk in these public gestures of forgiveness is the rush to reconciliation. It is the sense, especially among white Christians, that if a black person forgives, number one, they extrapolate that to the entire black community. Or if you say something against that, they say you're being unchristian. And then number two, they say, well, all is forgotten, all is forgiven. We can move on as if nothing happened without facing the consequences of their action. So you can forgive someone, but still face consequences. And that forgiveness, right, we often forget the words of Brant Jean's mother right after that, where she's saying there's...
Isn't that so interesting
Yeah.
that weaponizing of forgiveness required the erasure of a black woman? It required them to move past her and see, look, this is what we want. And it's like she said, and her words now, even as a mother, are buried.
Mm-hmm.
That's so fascinating
Yeah.
how it just requires this give and take. It's erasure.
Yeah,
in some way.
absolutely erasure. And her embodiment as a black woman is part of that erasure. But she was pointing to the systemic issues of police injustice and said, you know, Brant said it himself. He said, I speak for myself. And then she went on to say, whatever had transpired in the courtroom and with the sentencing, there were still deeper issues that needed to be addressed. And that's what we have to understand, is that forgiving doesn't mean that we're finished fighting injustice. It's not.
But if you what is the point of weaponizing? What is the point of weaponizing this act? And the point of weaponizing this act is to separate and divide us and to shift the power that we have together to stand against injustice. I think that's the difficult part, is people don't understand that I had to really come to grips with this. People really do not like that we stand against blatant injustice, that we vocalize it.
It's true.
And it seems so like, duh, of course they don't like it, but it's like you are disrupting power, you're disrupting the status quo, you're disrupting the empire,
Strongholds.
you're disrupting strongholds in a way. We actually had not a young man, we actually had an older black gentleman, I think he's here, Sherman, are you here? Yeah, Mr. Sherman. And he talked about praying, and he talked about how he prayed in his predominantly white church, and when he prayed, there was like a visceral reaction, like to that. And it's like, well, what about his prayer? Like, it's a, and I just honored the fact that he pressed through. But beyond that, it's like there is something. Willie Jennings calls it like the second skin, like on top, how whiteness like attaches to people like a second skin. So we pull it off. It's like violence. Like they feel like it's violence to them. And so as we think about that, as we consider that, it's like, man, there are heavy implications for this. I actually want to tell this story because Kimberly and I were at the screening of the Emmanuel documentary in D.C. And it was amazing to be across from the family, but very painful. And I was nervous because I was sitting back and, actually when you see families like this who make these gestures of forgiveness, you kind of view them as superheroes, like super Christians. And you're like, man, they may not be ordained, they may not have titles or anything like that, but they have another level that I can't attain to, or I feel is so far away. And so we sat across from them along with like 4 or 5 other black influencers and journalists, and we were asking them questions, and it was very tight in the room. And I didn't realize, I thought it was just a subject matter, and I thought the subject matter made it tight, but it was tight because there was disagreement in the room. And it was disagreement. We were sitting across from Nadine Collier, and it was disagreement about why we're even doing this. Now, I thought, it just didn't register for me how triggering and traumatizing this is, re-traumatizing this is for a family member to watch someone talk about your family member being killed, And so having to watch that and then answering questions about it and all this, and it was just like very tight. And Nadine was talking, and it wasn't some super deep response theologically. She was like, well, I just felt like hatred would overtake me if I didn't, do that. And so I just said it, and then everybody else was kind of like a domino effect, a ripple effect. Like, yeah, we forgive you. And again, black people taking on the burden of healing a community like ourselves, like with no help, like we'll forgive. You just brutalize us, we'll forgive. And I remember there was a gentleman to our right, and he had sunglasses on because I know he was emotional, and he said, I don't agree with any of this. And we were like, everybody was like, oh. And then like one of the activists, one of the older, he's like, well, this is just so powerful because, this. And he was like, no, I don't agree with this. Like they killed, I think it was his sister, they killed my sister. Like he killed my sister. Like he was like, I don't understand. And another man was like, and he even says in the documentary, unless you can show me where my sister was shot 6 times, if you can show me the points where she was shot, and I can feel, then I'll forgive him. He was like, he said, God's going to have to catch me. God's going to have to do that.
I think.
And it just destroyed all my neat little. And then at the end, Nadine was like, Nadine was angry. She said, I saw them put him in that car, in the police car, with no issue and incident after what he did to my mother. And she said, I'm angry right now. I'm like, man, how much of the weaponizing of forgiveness like robs black Christians of their agency enough to go through and be human and be vulnerable? Like we're human beings, we feel, Just because we're imagined doesn't mean we're not real. That's what I said, right?
Right. Just like that. Yeah, I mean, forgiveness and anger aren't mutually exclusive. And I also think that there's so little room in society for black anger that bitterness becomes attractive, right? Like there's so little space for legitimate outrage at injustice that in some senses, forget it. I'm done with y'all.
That is really good.
You know what I'm saying?
Wow.
So that's,
Yeah.
and forgiveness is an act of Christian faith, but also an act of self-preservation, right?
Right.
Not to hold on to that biting, acidic feeling within us. And we've been doing this for a long, long, long time. I was just at the 100-year anniversary of the Elaine massacre. Have you all heard about this? It is one of the deadliest race riots in American history, and yet very few people know about it. It happened in Elaine, Arkansas, in Phillips County, 30 minutes from where I live. And black sharecroppers were meeting in 1919 at a church, which Pastor Faison said the black church has been and still is the political, social, and economic center of the black community. These black sharecroppers were meeting as part of the Progressive Farmers and Household Union. They were organizing for fair prices on the cotton they themselves picked. It was a bumper crop that year. They were going to get paid if they got a fair price. So they had gotten a lawyer. They were organizing. They had armed guards outside because they knew this was dangerous. And sure enough, 3 white folks showed up. No one knows what happens, obviously, but a shootout ensued. One of the white men was killed. One was injured. Word spread, propaganda spread, that black people were waging an insurrection, an uprising, which harkens back to Civil War language and all this stuff. And so posses of white men came from a tri-state area, eventually including U.S. troops, and went about for several days the mass slaughter of children, women, and men, farmers in rural Arkansas. Estimates range. Most historians land on about 200 people being killed. And the reason I bring that up is they just opened, finally, a memorial a century later, and black people were not calling for vengeance. We weren't calling for revenge, or we're going to do the same thing to them as they did to us. But there was, I think it would have been appropriate to express a sense of outrage, anger at not only the killings, but the theft of land and money that has kept people in generational poverty for a century. I think it would be appropriate to be angry that black people had to bottle up this trauma, because to express it openly would have been to put their own lives at risk. And this has happened through generations. I think it would have been appropriate to express anger that the white community not only distorted the history, but hid it. And so you can't even talk about what happened. So we have to make room for that. And that's what I need people to understand, that there is such a thing as righteous anger. And black people have endured so much that it is totally understandable to be mad.
Well, and that goes back to our faith spaces. Like our faith spaces have to be places where they have to be emotionally healthy places, but they also have to be places where we actually promote healing and we actually promote safe vulnerability without it turning into voyeurism and all kinds of these little things that happen. And it is very difficult. Like, I think sometimes people don't understand in like multi-ethnic, multicultural spaces how that can turn into like voyeurism, like watching a black person grieve or go through something in a very like dehumanizing way. And so I think our churches need to have very vulnerable, safe spaces for us to be fully human and fully known and fully loved. And I think the black church does that extremely well with all its faults and flaws. And so I'm glad that Dr. Faison talked about the black church last night, because I think there needs to be a revival of young black people taking responsibility and stepping into those spaces to act as healing agents and advocates, and adjusting our posture to continue that legacy on to our generation and to the generation that will come after us. So,
Amen. Joy and justice.
Joy and justice. Are we done? That's it? That's all the time we have? I was gonna take some questions too.
It's past time.
It's past time. Okay. Anybody? One question. They're gonna
3
be
questions.
so mad at me.
Three questions.
They're gonna be so
But we'll
mad
be
at us.
fast.
They're gonna be so mad at us.
I think we're good. Oh, Bo is
Real
sick as
quick,
head.
real quick, stand up. Stand up and be counted.
Nobody?
Nobody? Okay, cool.
Oh, they don't want to talk to us. That's all right.
Oh, go ahead. Oh, go ahead, my man. You stood up.
I'll speak briefly. I think deep down, white people are afraid that black people will one day do to them what they've done to us. If you look at slave uprisings, right? Like they knew what they were. They knew they would not want to be in the position of an enslaved person. And so for an enslaved person to rise up and say no more, it put the fear of God in them, because they knew on some level that retribution would be just. It would at least be an understandable reaction,
Yes.
right?
That was trauma laughter. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So I think part of it is a fear born of guilt.
Yeah. And they know how powerful we are. They know. They know. We don't know. We don't recognize it, but they know. They know how powerful we are. They know what we're capable of. Okay, next. Man, I'm very careful to speak to an experience that I have not had, but I also, I hope that genuinely hope that you have spaces where you can be fully yourself, fully present, places where you're not forced to adjust or modulate who you are to fit the expectations of others. And I think so. It's very important for you though to recognize that. Christ calls us into a new family.
Yeah.
And so I understand the impetus and the impulse not to, reject family and not to reject that. But there's some fights you're supposed to fight, and then there's some fights you don't need to. And I think some of you should fight from a distance, a safe distance for your own heart and mind and soul. And you being a young man, there is so much more for you to do. The very necessary function of racism is distraction. And I think sometimes we're just trying to save people, and it's like, well, I'm going to pray, and I've made my appeal, but what I need to do is I need to make sure that I protect my heart and my mind and my soul for my future generations, so that I haven't been spent giving to people who will never receive. So. Okay, yeah, one more. Y'all play rock, paper, scissors for it. But yeah. I'll say something before I kick this to Jamar. Like, we actually really need, and I think this is probably something that we need to do if we have a conference next year or whenever we do this. Again, we really need to lean into our tradition of writing and voices and people who have gone before us, because they wrestle with this and there's materials. And I think we we don't see it proliferated. So I think part of it is we need to actually see how our brothers and sisters who have gone before us have responded in even more difficult circumstances than what we're in right now. So I think we need to lean into that narrative a little bit, and we actually need to proliferate those resources so that people, we know them, we know that, and we're familiar with that. That's a big
Recovery.
Jamal.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't know how to say this. This is such a passion for me. It's not the white theologian, they're not the only option. Please, just.
Don't get us going.
I'm, man, it's like it's the only option. I can't find.
Look, if you out there talking about you're about racial justice and you still only ever quote dead white men,
Please stop.
like how is that?
Stop.
How? I know your level of
So many
commitment.
great black women theologians.
I mean, look.
Come on, man. Yeah, but that is one thing that's like on my heart for us to like increase our literacy, understanding of what's gone before. But you can speak to some other stuff.
No, I mean, I just think people have a very skewed conception of Christianity. And one of the things that we have to do is say that Christianity has the range to encompass joy and justice, forgiveness and anger, love and hatred of sin, right? It encompasses all of that. And so I wonder if the resistance to faith is a misunderstanding of faith. And we can give so many examples from the black church, but even the Bible itself, right? As we go throughout the entire human experience. Like there's nothing that's going to be new in the human experience to Scripture. So I think our challenge is to unpack that in a new way for a new generation.
I mean, God is
You know? Angrier than we are.
Do we really sit in that, though?
That's right.
Or do we just pass through it? Yeah. I think that's all the time we have. Yeah.
Pastime. But thank you.
Thank you guys so much for being here. Actually, hold up. Lunch now. Lunch is through the Smith Chapel, up the steps.